So good morning, Luvuyo. Good morning, Vandudzai.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine. I'm fine. So we have this very interesting session on rural development, which is key for Africa's development.
Yes.
So I think it's time we should start. Start the session.
Yeah. Okay. I know I was scheduled to be the second one to present. I'm not sure if that's still the case.
Yes, I think we will follow the schedule that we have in the program. Luvuyo first, then yes, then you, Vandudzai, and the last will be Idongesit. So I have maybe a few words of introduction. So I will be chairing this session. I am Ferdinand Bakoup. I am an economist and I work for the African Development Bank, where I am a lead economist. I'm based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. So you are all welcome to this session. I see we have maybe you. So since we are starting the session, we will the panelists. You will be introduced as you speak. You make your presentation. We start now with Luvuyo. Luvuyo is currently a PhD, finishing his. You are finishing your PhD in development studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Yes. Okay, thank you. Welcome, Luvuyo. And you are looking at the interventions that work in achieving water development management in South Africa. A very a key topic, huh? This is, yes, very important, especially in South Africa. I worked on South Africa for a while. I did when I was in that department in the bank. I prepared the African Development Bank country assistance strategy for South Africa. I led that team at some point. And I remember water management was a very important topic for discussion. So your strategy is very, very important. You also work at the National Department of Water and Sanitation in South Africa as Chief Development Specialist, responsible for water services policy and evaluation. So without and your presentation today is about a systematic review highlighting the unintended consequences of decentralization of water resources management in South Africa. So with these few words of introduction, I will give you the floor, Luvuyo, to make your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. I don't know whether you can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen.
You can see my screen. Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Ferdinand. As you've already highlighted that I'm looking at the systematic review that is highlighting the unintended consequences of decentralization of water resource management in South Africa. This is a part of a broader PhD findings. As you've already alluded, that PhD is looking at the interventions that work in achieving integrated water resources management in South Africa in general. So before I come to this, it's important to contextualize the issues that are faced by South Africa, especially in terms of its water resource management. So I'll take you through the colonialization phase. We know we were colonized by the British and also by the Dutch. And in doing so, in the 1910s, they formed the Union of South Africa, in which the first parliament was formed, and the black majority were excluded in that formation of Union of South Africa. Then in the 1912, we had the developments around the Irrigation and Conservation Water Act, which essentially looked at managing the water resources for irrigation purposes, because at that time farming was important. Then you come into the 1940s, where they instituted, or in the 1913, where they instituted what was called the Natives Land Act, which was essentially legitimizing the dispossession of black majority out of their land. So they were dispossessed of their land, and it was made legal. So in the 1948, then the introduction of apartheid, and that's where the division took place. Then in the 1956, we had the National Water Act, which essentially sought to move away from the Irrigation Act of 1912 and take into consideration other development issues that were happening at that time. So the water was now prioritized for industries, including the farming. So now coming into the late 1990s, there was a transition from this apartheid government towards a democratic dispensation. In the 1994, we had our first election. Then in 1996, we had the constitution, the first democratic constitution. So since 1994, during that period, in terms of the water resource management, there was this drive to manage our water resources in an integrated manner, where we acknowledge that difficulties in the management of these resources. Then in the 1998, we adopted a new National Water Act, which takes into cognizance various aspects of water for the environment, water for social development, and it was the first first of its kind National Water Act, which sought to promote social justice. Then, if you go to in 2003, we had the development of the National Water Resource Strategy 2, which adopted integrated water resource management as an approach to manage our water resources in South Africa. So since then there was this development. In 2009, the Department of Water and Sanitation developed a strategy which was called Water for Growth and Development Frameworks. Within that strategy, there was an introduction of a new paradigm which was called developmental water management. That paradigm sought to explain the state of the South African country as a developmental state, and within that parameters, the using of water as a center to achieve the developmental aspiration of the country. Then in 2009, we developed the National Water Resource Strategy 2. This strategy 2 sought to operationalize some of the targets that were set by the National Developmental Plan, and it borrowed the developmental water management paradigm from the Water for Growth and Developmental Framework. So within the NWRS 2, it was acknowledged that South Africa will continue using the integrated water resource management approach as an overarching water management paradigm that would be used in the management of water resources. However, to operationalize integrated water resource management, there was a need to adopt integrated, the need to adopt developmental water management at a strategic level. So the developmental water management brought two distinct issues. One, it promoted the issue of equity, which is something that IRRM was lacking. Two, it brought the issue of localization of the IRRM. So we thought, no, we need to localize and operationalize IRRM so that it addresses South African problems. So through a literature search and literature review, what was found when I was looking at what's happening around the topic of integrated water resource management in South Africa. And most of the studies that look at IRRM were either missing or reported poorly. By that, I mean that not only studies that seeks to explain what IRRM is, but the studies that looked at the effects of IRRM, that looks at the interventions at IRRM, they were not there. And in terms of in South Africa in general, there was an abstract understanding of what IRRM is and what it entails. And the IRRM itself as an approach made no clear a distinction between the present and the future management of the water resources. But one of the most important things that the IRRM did was to propose to divide government into different functional areas, what they call river basins management. In South Africa, we call it catchment management, either agencies or areas. So, in terms of the implementation of integrated water resource management, it has been difficult, especially for water managers, as they didn't know what parameters are needed to monitor in order to show that the water resources are managed in an integrated manner. At a global level, we are still yet to know what constitutes IRRM, how we should manage water in order for a system to remain inherently integrated for a long period of time. And as these, some of the critics were coming from academics such as Biswas, and it was also applied in terms of the South African context. Then when we looked at the South African policies, legislation and strategies, what I saw was that they only narrate the issues or the problems that we already know, and they fail on going about dealing with such problems. So in terms of a South African context, maybe at a global level, IRRM fails to acknowledge the complexity of democracy in the participation and the heterogeneity of societies across the world. So when this approach was adopted at the Dublin conference, they said that it would be an innovative way of managing water resources across the country, across the globe. And there was a lot of money that was pumped in order for this approach to be upscaled in different countries. But at that time, when they adopted it, they failed to recognize that different countries have, they are diverse in nature. And with that diversity, as much as in South African context, we are South Africans, but we are so different in terms of culture, how we live, and all sorts of that. So because of those reasons, the IRRM at an international and South African context remains a theory about, an argument for, and at best a set of principles for a certain approach to water management. So how do we try to ensure that this does not remain a theory or an argument? That's where the PhD thesis is trying to look, to say, what are these interventions that are there that work in achieving this IRRM. So you will see that I will use integrated water resource management and developmental water management interchangeably. When I refer to IRRM, it's in broad term. When I say DWM, it includes the principle of equity, because it's not there in IRRM. So my questions were, what evidence of intervention types are there to promote IRRM? And the second one was, what are the effects of those interventions? So for the purpose of the presentation, I'll be looking at those two. So to answer the first one, in terms of what are the types of intervention that are there, I had to do evidence mapping. And this was the process that was followed. You know, first you have to develop a scope, you formulate a question, and you develop a search string, and you identify databases where you're going to search for relevant studies. You screen evidence against inclusion and exclusion criteria. I used the PICO method of population intervention comparator outcomes. Then I did a data extraction. After data extraction, then there was a presentation of an evidence map. This is just a snapshot of it, but it's a much bigger evidence map. And the intervention were derived from a Global Water Partnership Toolbox, which have sorts of interventions ranging from the enabling environment and so on. And my outcomes were divided into 3 categories. The first, it was social outcomes, environmental outcomes, and also the intermediate one, which looks at the formation of different organizations. Then we had to go on and do a systematic review. And within the evidence map itself, because of the nature of the research, we couldn't try to synthesize or do a systematic review of all the interventions. Reason being, because this is a PhD project, so we wanted something to be, we wanted a practicable research. But this evidence map is a living document. It can be updated and synthesized later on. So in terms of a systematic review, we built on the interventions of the evidence map, and we chose 2 of those interventions to synthesize. One was the policy, 2, the legal frameworks. Then after that, we did the critical appraisal, where they were rated in terms of the evidence design, the evidence conduct, evidence analysis, and evidence conclusion, as this slide is showing. So after all those critical appraisal, and those studies passed this critical appraisal process, we then, why is not moving? We then moved into the synthesis of the evidence itself. So in terms of the synthesis of the evidence, we did a data extraction. I don't know why is it not moving, but I'll talk through the presentation. Okay, we did a data extraction. This data extraction was only done on studies that passed the critical appraisal stage. Then I did a line-by-line coding at those intervention and the outcomes. After that, then I did evidence synthesis. With evidence synthesis, I used the qualitative evidence synthesis methodology. From the coding of the line-by-line coding of those intervention vis-a-vis the outcomes, I had different descriptive themes. From the descriptive themes, I have to analyze them, then I produce the analytical themes. Then it is these analytical themes that I'm going to talk to. And I'm talking to only 2 of the 6 analytical themes that came out in terms of evidence. One of the findings was that decentralization of IRRM actually actually entrenches inequalities in these institutions of participation. You say that IRRM says that there should be decentralization of power and the management of the water resource must be at a river basin. However, in South Africa, because of its heterogeneous society, that has been a nightmare. Firstly, our institutions, your catchment management agencies, your water user associations, come as a result of the water institutions that were formed during the apartheid period. Remember the period of segregation. So within these structures, the evidence shows that how the structures were formed even post-democracy influenced how people participated. In some cases, some structures were not transformed and we expected a Black majority to participate in those structures. Therefore, their voice was not being heard. And the other thing was that the democracy in the institution has led up to other institutions having more power than the others. This is in the case where we see that these river basin institutions that are dominated by white people, in most cases have more power than those who are dominated by Black people in terms of the resources, and also the monetary resources, and also the allocation of water resources to that particular institutions. And what we have seen, the evidence shows that participation in these institutions does not automatically ensures equality and equity. The IRRM...
Sorry, could you try to conclude in the next minute or two, please?
Okay, if we look at the other part that talks to the issue of women, is that especially in these institutions that are in rural areas, they still function under the patriarchal norms, where women are not free to express their views. They're citing that they are being shy, and they cite that they can't express their views in front of men, and the participation of women is traditionally defined, and the access to property is also for women needs an approval from men, and we've seen that these cultural norms, they still perpetuate the gatekeeping and power relation in terms of water resource management. So that's the basic tenet of the findings of the systematic review. Thanks, Ferdinand.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luvuyo, for this presentation. Maybe we listen to all the presentations, and then before I would say the exchange session. We now move to Vandudzai. Yes, Vandudzai, it's up to you now. Vandudzai is a very experienced socio-economic researcher with about 13 years of experience in socio-economic research, impact assessments, and consultancy, gained mainly in academic and research institutions. She has been carrying out her work largely on socio-economic analysis, research, policy analysis of the South African economy. The areas of interest are economy-wide modeling of socio-economic policies and shocks, mainly on employment, poverty, and inequality. It's very important. I also saw that Vandudzai used a CGE model. I also built such a model when I was doing my PhD. Vandudzai holds a PhD in economics from the University of Johannesburg, a master's degree in economics from the University of Pretoria, and honors degree in economics from the University of Zimbabwe. She's currently a partnership for economic policy researcher and currently a consultant with UNDP. Okay. Thank you very much, Vandudzai. You are welcome to make your presentation, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ferdinand. Okay, so my study looks at the impacts of raw economic development through agriculture policy in South Africa, focusing on poverty, inequality, and gender. Okay, I just need confirmation if my slides are moving. I move to the second one because I'm not very experienced with this.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so just in summary, the outline is I'm going to give a context to this study and then give an overview of the project, questions and objectives, methodology and data used, and then a summary of the research results and key findings, and then conclude. Okay, so South Africa is among the top giants on the African continent in terms of GDP. It contributes 16% to Africa's GDP. However, despite its might on the continent, it is characterized by persistent challenges, which include unemployment, inequality, poverty, as well as exclusion of women. And those who live in the rural areas and women are the most vulnerable. The country has been, or let me say government, has been trying over the years, if we look at the 2014 to 2019 medium-term strategic framework and the current medium-term strategic framework as well for 2019 to 2024, both advocate for rural development with targets and actions that include provision of more infrastructure, financial support, as well as technical support to smallholder farmers on the agricultural side of the policies. These challenges, we see that they've been persistent. Unemployment, inequality, and poverty. If you look from 1994, when the country attained democracy, there hasn't been a significant improvements in these challenges. And actually, this has further been highlighted by the current pandemic, which further brought to, for these challenges. So the more need to address them. This study is, we believe, of relevance to South Africa. Why? Because job creation policies as well as poverty and inequality reduction strategies are critical in the country, based again on the brief overview that I gave. Rural development is widely acknowledged as a strategy to improve the economic and social life of the rural poor. When we look at inequality and poverty in South Africa, we see that it's more pronounced in the rural areas. And I think if the country has to make significant improvements of inequality, then there's need to put more effort and resources in the rural economy in order to reduce the gap between the urban and the rural populations. For quite some time, there's been discussions on land expropriation in South Africa, and the talk has been on land redistribution without compensation. Of course, there are criticism of this type of policy, but actually in September, early September, it was adopted. The bill was signed early September, which means the country is eventually going to see redistribution of land without compensation. And even for some of the developments that have been made on the land, if the government deems that the land needs to be redistributed, then even the developments will not be compensated as well. That's what the policy says, which shows also the importance of agriculture, the importance of land, the importance of trying to address some of the challenges faced in the country through land and through agriculture. And many studies show that there is potential for informal agriculture as well to contribute to job creation, and it is a key policy issue in the country currently. So this means as land is redistributed, it's not only being taken from the formal agriculture, maybe from the whites to the blacks, but the idea is to try and also include informal agriculture, not so formal, including the small scale farmers as well. So the key research questions and objectives of this study have been to look at what is the impact of reallocating land from formal to informal agriculture. What is the impact of supporting the raw economy by increasing capital spending in the agricultural sector as a whole? And also to try and understand if this yields differential impacts on male versus female labor. Remember, at the beginning, I indicated that females are disadvantaged compared to males, as well as the rural population. So it's both to analyze along the gender lines as well as the rural urban benefits or impacts on the rural households versus the urban households. So the objective has been to analyze effects of reallocation of land to informal agriculture, as well as an increase in agricultural capital spending on the raw economy, to see how this has an impact on poverty and inequality, using CGE analysis for the macro aspect, which includes your GDP, impact on labor, as well as using microsimulation analysis, which informs us on the impacts on poverty and inequality. Okay, so this study was based on the dynamic CGE model, which is the PEP, Poverty and Economic Partnership Network model. But of course, it was adapted to make it gender specific and as well as to include wage differentials, because the literature shows that the wages or the salaries of females are slightly lower than those of males, irrespective of education or where people work. So women earn relatively less compared to their male counterparts. So the study also tried to address that. It was also adapted to include unemployment, which is a reality in Africa and especially in South Africa, because the model is the generic model. It assumes full employment, which is not a reality for us. So the simulations that were carried out were to increase the smallholder land that is in form of or proxied by increase in capital, 7.5% increase for smallholder, which means reallocation of land from formal to informal agriculture. We modeled two sectors for agriculture, the formal one as well as the informal one. And the second simulation was a 10% increase in capital for both the agricultural sectors. Now this means across the board for the small scale as well as the small scale or informal as well as the formal sector. Okay, so in terms of data, this CGE model was calibrated with the 2015 social accounting matrix, which was modified to disaggregate labor by skill and gender using information from the labor force survey. And households were disaggregated by rural-urban divide using the general household survey. And the agricultural sector was disaggregated to smallholder and commercial or informal and formal using literature. There are quite a number of studies which give us information on the size of the formal versus the informal agriculture in South Africa. So this was the macro part, which is the CG model, which gives us the macro analysis. And then the results from this CG model were then put as inputs in the micro-simulation model in order to be able to analyze the household effects as well as the individual effects. And this micro-simulation model had 3 occupational choices where the workers are either working for a salary, formally employed, or self-employed, or not working, which give us the unemployed labor. And the micro-simulation model used the National Income Dynamics survey, that is the needs data for 2015. So because our social accounting matrix was for 2015 and the survey data was for 2015, so there's really no need to make adjustments or waiting because it's for the same year. Okay, so we analyzed, as I mentioned, agricultural policy to support rural economic development and see the impact on poverty inequality in general, that is income inequality as well as gender inequality. So this was through first reallocation of land to smallholder agriculture, as well as an increase in agricultural spending. So for the first simulation, it shows us that if we reallocate land from formal agriculture to small-scale agriculture, the results indicate that there's an increase in demand for unskilled labor, which is a positive result. Why? Because usually the skilled labor earn more than unskilled labor. So if their demand increase, we see a reduction in the unemployment level of this kind of labor. And we also know that mostly or commonly, the poorer households have more of the unskilled labor. So again, we expect to see an impact on poorer households. There is an increase in household consumption. There's a decline in unemployment, and also we see more females benefiting. But of course, this result could also be influenced by the fact that we modeled a wage differential. Therefore, it's relatively cheaper for firms to hire female labor, which is paid slightly lower than male labor, but still it has a benefit in terms of gender inequality. However, there is a decline in income for poor households. When we look at the increase in agricultural capital spending for both sectors, for the formal as well as informal agriculture, we see an increase in GDP, which stimulates capital demand across sectors. So this one will have a better impact across sectors and therefore for the whole economy. However, rural households benefit relatively less than their urban counterparts. So in summary, households have lower consumption under the second simulation of increasing capital spending for the whole agricultural sector than when we reallocate land from formal to informal agriculture. So the key findings in summary are that increasing smallholder agricultural land could have positive effect on the labor market. Female labor benefits relatively better than their male counterparts when land is reallocated to smallholder farmers. And thus there's a positive effect on the gap between people with low skills as well as those with, compared to those with higher skills. However, with an increase in capital, that is the second simulation, male labor benefits relatively better than females, that is measured by the decline in unemployment. Urban households also experience a relatively higher rise in consumption compared to rural households. I think this is not unexpected because normally the owners of the farms, because here we increased for both formal and informal agriculture. And the owners of formal agriculture usually are the whites or the richer households, which normally as well stay in the urban areas and maybe have workers on their farms. So overall, the study shows that reallocation of land gives relatively better outcomes than increasing agricultural spending across the board. So the policy implications of this study are that government should probably consider land reallocation in economic transformation tool that can benefit low-skilled labor, unskilled labor, as well as female labor. But there is also a need to explore alternative poverty alleviation measures, because the results indicate that increasing capital in the agricultural sector does not directly impact on poverty levels. And the recommendations are that there is, or it appears that it's good or it's ideal for government to increase land for small-scale farming, as well as to increase agriculture support through capital spending. However, there is need to address lack of policy implementation, usually which happens because of limited funding. So probably most of the times the policies are there, but it's the implementation which is lacking. And also address the declining state capacity to implement policies, as well as corruption, which could lead to leakage of resources. Another recommendation is that the government should consider allocating agricultural resources to women as well as youth in the townships and or rural areas. This helps to improve food security. There has been issues with food security from around 2019. In 2019, actually 11% of the population, which translates to about 6.5 million people.
Vandudzai, would you try to seek to conclude in the next minute, please?
Yes, thanks. And also it would help to address poverty and gender inequality. However, while the results show that these are important in terms of supporting agriculture, it's also important to acknowledge that land redistribution alone will not be enough to reduce poverty. Therefore, other strategies for rural development are critical. This includes infrastructure investment in the rural areas, equipping the rural population with skills, because usually even if the government could increase support in capital spending, but if the people do not have the knowledge on how to use it or on how to take advantage of that, still it might not have the desired results. So these are the recommendations from the study. And lastly, just to say thank you for listening to this presentation. And I want to mention that this research was carried out with technical as well as financial support from the Partnership for Economic Policy, PEP. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vandudzai, for this very important and clear presentation. We will go directly to the third presentation, which will be made by Idongesit. Idongesit, are you connected? We don't appear to have Idongesit for the third presentation. So in this case, we will, if there are comments and maybe suggestions, we can hear from the participants, we can exchange views. Are there comments?
I think there is one for me coming from Ramona.
Okay, yes, okay.
She's asking whether I can unpack the findings relating to democracy in institution and power. Also, if participation does not automatically ensure equality and equity, what else is required? So with regards to that, it was important that I draw the contextualization of where we come from. I see that even my contextualization spoke to Vandudzai's presentation with regards to the dispossession land and whatnot. So to answer that question is that during the apartheid period, the institutions that were formed, such as your irrigation boards, were only serving, or the only participant that were there were white, mostly male farmers, right? Then through the transition of democracy, we developed the National Water Act, in which we said within that act that the irrigation boards, which were institutions developed under the apartheid period, need to be transformed into water use association. What has been the problem is that many of those institutions have not been transformed. It means that they are still operating under the prescript of the apartheid laws. And those that were transformed, they were only transformed on the basis of complying with the legislation. But the basic fabrics of what controls those institutions was not overly changed. So when you take Black people to come and participate in these institutions that are already formed and that already have a certain culture, it becomes difficult for them to have a meaningful participation. So that power dynamics is very present in those institutions. There are many of them. We've seen even in rural areas. So the issue of equality or participation does not automatically ensure equality and equity. It is based on those findings and based on the contextualization of these water management institutions. What is required? The simple thing is an overhaul of the system, restart these river basin organizations so that they represent the demographics. Even if you look at who participate in those institutions, it's only white male farmers, and even your industry such as your mining, which are represented by white male, your other steel industry and many industries. So there's a need for an overhaul of the system. There is a need for a proper implementation of the prescript of the National Water Act. There is a need to change these irrigation boards and transform them into water use associations and ensure that within the formation of these new institutions, they represent the demographics of the country, not the demographic of those who have power, the monetary and resource powers. So I think that's what needs to be done. We need to be really be radical about it and implement what the legal framework already prescribes. Thank you.
There is another question on the chat from Carlos on what needs to be done to improve policy implementation. I think that's a very important but difficult question always. Okay, so Luvuyo can agree or disagree with me, but I think in South Africa, it's not so much lack of funding as in other African countries, if we are to compare, but maybe political will, because I did another study about 3 years ago on the spending capacity of municipalities in South Africa. And you find that quite a number of them, they fail to spend the budget allocated. So it takes us to the problem of political will. So I'm not sure what solution can be done, but I think if policymakers and implementers work more with academics, even I think highlighting such issues is important. put it on the table that, okay, this is what was allocated, this was what was spent. What can government do in order to improve on service delivery? Because in most cases, the funds are there, but service delivery is not happening because the money is not being spent as planned. So it's quite a challenge. I agree. But I think we need to continue, as I said, reminding each other what can be done. Maybe researchers coming in, working together with policymakers until such a time when something really happens. Okay, there is another question for me from Maduri on how do you define small-scale farming in South Africa in terms of size, and what size is big enough to ensure that families can still market their produce? Okay, so actually the definition is not agreed upon to say what is small scale. It includes size, which I think is below a hectare, if I remember well. It also includes the type of, what can I say, the tools that are being used. They don't have machinery most of the time. They rely more on labor. These are your small scale, but it's also quite another challenge on what exactly are we defining as a small scale. So for this study, small scale is those which use labor largely for their activities and do not have much capital or machinery. And in terms of what size is big enough to ensure that families can still market their produce, I don't think it's so much about size. It also depends on the type of products that a family is growing. For example, if it's your market gardening, tomatoes, it doesn't need like much land, for example, as compared to animal husbandry. So I think the type of farming that the small scale farmers are into also matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandudzai. I posted a question. I don't know if you have seen it. I was asking the result. One of the results of the simulation. The simulations is that in the reallocation of land leads to an increase in the demand for unskilled labor. But this policy also leads to a fall in the income for poor households. How will you explain this? Because one would normally expect that the skilled labor is mainly supplied by poor households, and if the demand for unskilled labor increases, then they may have more income. But the result appears to show that there is a fall in the income. You appear to be muted. Can you unmute? Vandudzai, you are muted.
Sorry, I forgot. Okay, so I was saying, I think we would expect, yes, that's what we would expect even for us before the study, that's what we expected. But I think that would be the definite result probably if we use partial equilibrium analysis. But with CGE, remember, it doesn't only affect that sector and those households that benefit from that sector, but it's economy-wide. So it also affects other sectors, especially the formal agriculture. When its production goes down, those that it employs also are affected, which also include some low-income earners. So it's the overall impact now that we find that it's actually not bringing out the desirable outcome, hence the suggestion of alternative policies to ensure that it has the desired effect on poverty in overall.
Okay, thank you. Yes. I think I would.
Can I ask my fellow panelists, because it's really an interesting study, considering the nature of what is happening currently in South Africa, the land and whatnot. I was wondering, is the report or the findings already publicized or published? Have you tried maybe to present this to the government in general? The basis of that is that we have seen so many people in South Africa, especially the privileged and those who have access to the resources, opposing the strategic position that the government has taken in terms of the expropriation of land without compensation. And we have seen so many haysayers and doomsayers saying that you'll be like Zimbabwe and whatnot, you'll be a failed state. And when such results come in from a study, a scientific study saying the opposite, then I know it creates that good environment for an academic debate, and also to inform these naysayers and doomsayers to say, actually, a study has been done, and this is what the results of the simulation, what could be the outcomes of such a policy direction. So I think it will be important that gets into the right people. It's shown into a government, senior political government people, so that at least it has a basis in terms of responding to the doomsayers.
Okay, thank you, Luvuyo and Ramona. We actually, on this project, we worked with government officials from the Gauteng Department of Economic Development, the director on the road development side. And we did, together with them, we actually had a workshop in June to present the results, which was quite informative. But of course, as you are saying, I think it's a bit of a challenge. I think sharing is difficult, especially for those who have resources right now, because sharing only means taking away part from them. And I think it doesn't come easy always. I'm planning to actually publish, this study was published as a working paper on the PEP website, but from the conference as well that I mentioned with people from government, from civil society, from academia, the plan is to have a report of the discussions that happened after presenting these results, and I will definitely share with you.
Oh, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Vandudzai. So overall, we are close to the end of our session. But the policy of land reallocation, so it appears from the results that this policy will not reduce inequality, as we have that was its objective. So how will this contribute to the discussion in South Africa?
Okay, I think probably it's the way that we modeled. and also because we just modeled reallocation of land from the small, I mean, from the formal to the informal. But I think there's also a need to do more in terms of labor. I think who is benefiting, because if it's the same people that were working in those areas, I think we need more just to give them only land, because the land is just part of it. So as I mentioned, of course, this is not in the model, but in reality, actually, if we only take land and give to Luvuyo, who has skills on how to farm, and you give another one to me who has no clue on how to farm, of course, we will not get the same results. So we're trying to point out that land alone is not the solution. We need to do more. And there is, I think it's Ben Cousins, who has written a lot about these land issues. He also mentioned that there is need to do more. Land, we're saying it's a necessary condition, if I may say, but not sufficient. So it's one step in the right direction. But again, as Luvuyo was saying, if we give land to the people, but they don't have right to water, it's not a solution on its own. So we need to have a holistic approach to all this.
Okay, thank you very much to Luvuyo. Thank you, Vandudzai, for the excellent presentations. I think we have come to the end of our session. Thank you to all the participants. See you all in other sessions of the conference. Thank you.
Have a nice day. Thank you very much. Same to you.
Thank you.